I hope my slides are going to appear. I'm going to tell you there we go. I'm going to tell you, as you can see, my top 10 trends for 2021. And this is because one of the hats that I wear at The Economist is looking after our annual, The World In, which has just come out. So these are predictions taken from the pages of the annual, which has just been published on our website. So can we have the next slide, please? Oh, do I have control of the slides? No, I don't. Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, so at The Economist, we like to think about the future. We publish articles where we try to predict things, like this article about the morality of artificial intelligence, which I published in 2012, so quite a long time ago. And we also have two annuals which look at future scenarios. I'm told I can control the slides, but I don't see where. So sorry, I'm just going to have to ask. I have no controls or anything that I can see. Sorry. We have two annual publications. One is called The World If, which you can see in the middle, and it consists of articles from the future. So we imagine that articles from a future copy of The Economist have somehow traveled through time, and we're able to see them. So we published those, and this year the theme was climate. And we had a range of articles from 2022 up to about 2050. And we also have an annual, The World In, which comes out in November and looks at the following year. So what I'm about to tell you is the 10 trends, which I think are most important, taken from the pages of The World in 2021. And let's have the first slide, please. So the first trend, and obviously the most important thing at the moment, is what happens with the pandemic and what happens with vaccines in particular. And really everything else depends on this. It is a very uncertain year, 2021, because you've got these three overlapping areas of uncertainty in healthcare and the virus and what happens there. That then has economic implications, and then there are political complications as well, and they're all sort of mixed together. But it really starts with the vaccine, and there are many vaccines, but there are at least two now that we know work very well, and there are several more following close on their heels. So there will be a choice of vaccines in the next few weeks, and the big question is, how quickly will those vaccines be rolled out? How well organized will different countries be, and who will get them? And this is going to lead, I think, to fights both between countries and within countries about access to the vaccines. So at the moment, there aren't, no, can we go back to the previous one, please? At the moment, there are some countries that have placed orders for large amounts of vaccines. So Britain and America have done that. There are a lot of countries that can't afford them on their own. So there's this big initiative, COVAX, which is trying to ensure the safe distribution of vaccines. Basically, the rich countries will be paying for the vaccines for the poor countries. And the plan is to get about 3% coverage in all of those member countries initially, and they hope to get to 20% coverage by the end of the year. Now, the reason I say this is that even in the countries that have good access to vaccines, they're going to start with the healthcare workers and with the vulnerable populations first. And people like me who are healthy and middle-aged I would be surprised if I get a vaccine before the middle of next year. So the idea that this is going to quickly solve the problem in early 2021, I don't think is true. It's going to take a long time to get these vaccines manufactured and distributed, and it's going to be quite difficult. It's been very impressive that the vaccines have been developed as quickly as they can, but actually distributing them is just as difficult. We need needles, we need lots of those little glass bottles. Some of the vaccines need to be stored at very low temperatures. This is a very big logistical problem. And we've seen that governments have already been struggling in the early days of the pandemic. They struggled with the access to and distribution of masks and PPE of various kinds. And vaccines are much more difficult. Masks are just made of plastic and they can sit in a warehouse for a while. They don't need to be kept cold. Vaccines are much more difficult to distribute. And we've seen that some countries are more organized than other countries when it comes to testing and tracking, so on. And this distribution of the vaccine is also going to be a big challenge for organization. So I think we're going to see wide variations in how effectively countries roll this out. And then further complicating this, we have a couple of other factors. We have the politics of vaccines. So some countries, notably China, want to use their vaccines as a political tool. So China is offering its vaccines to its allies, and it hopes to sort of win political advantage from this. So we're going to see sort of vaccine diplomacy. Other countries are boasting about their ability to make vaccines quickly. Russia is doing this. Vaccine nationalism. And Donald Trump has also been emphasizing the role of American companies in developing vaccines quickly and trying to take credit for it. So this is being politicized very quickly. And we can expect that to continue next year too. The other complicating factor is whether some people will refuse to have vaccines because either they're worried about vaccines in general, or because they're okay with vaccines most of the time, but they worry that these vaccines, which have been developed very quickly, might not be safe because of the speed at which they've been developed. Now, I don't think that's true. I think the safety protocols have been followed, but there are going to be people who say, even if you offer them a vaccine, that they'd rather not have it. So all of that leads to an enormous amount of uncertainty that I think we can expect. And the idea that the vaccine is a silver bullet is, I'm afraid, not the case. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So this is the economic recovery. And what happens here depends to a large extent on what happens with the vaccine. So we've seen in recent months that economic recovery has been very patchy. There was a bounce back in the middle of the year in Europe after the first wave of lockdowns came to an end. And now we've got into another set of lockdowns and economic activity is slowing down again. And we can see this happening in different countries, different states, different regions, and also different industries, starting and stopping. So it's a very bumpy, patchy, uneven recovery. And it will take a while for the vaccine to sort of calm things down. And even then, some industries aren't going to come back. So we've seen, for example, chains of high street shops that have gone bust and aren't going to be coming back after this pandemic comes to an end, whenever that is. So this is reshaping the world. We're not going to go back to the world the way that it was before. And that means that some jobs that are currently being preserved by governments, and this is particularly in Europe, we see governments are paying companies they're basically keeping the companies alive on life support. Other countries like America are letting companies go bust and then basically giving cash to people who are unemployed to help support them. And those two different philosophies we're going to see working in different ways. And European countries are going to have to make some very difficult decisions early next year about when to discontinue the life support for companies that they're currently providing. It's very expensive, and it also means that they'll be sustaining some companies that may not have a long-term future. So we're going to see a big argument about that. We're also going to see the phenomenon that strong companies, big companies, are getting stronger. They can continue to maintain investment in these difficult times, and they can take market share from smaller companies, and as small companies go bust and leave the market. So this is going to lead to more inequality between companies as the big get bigger and the rich companies get richer. And another winner in all of this has been Chinese companies. The Chinese economy has bounced back incredibly quickly. In fact, if you look at forecasts now for the size of the Chinese economy at the end of 2021, it is predicted to be just as big as everyone thought it was going to be when they made predictions in 2019. So it will be in China, if that happens, it will be as if the pandemic had never happened. China has bounced back so quickly, but it really is unique in that regard. Very few other countries have seen such rapid rebounds. And so Chinese companies are in a stronger position and can take market share in some areas. And of course, they're also big providers of things like PPE, masks, and so on. So the big winners from all of this are basically the bigger companies and some Chinese companies. Okay, so we've got the uncertainty around the vaccine, we've got the uncertainty around the economy, and next slide, please. We've also got uncertainty in geopolitics. We've seen in the past decade that the international rules-based order, all of the institutions that were created after the Second World War, has been crumbling. And Donald Trump has obviously accelerated that process, but it was in fact going on before his presidency began. So he has cast doubt on NATO, and he has paralyzed the World Trade Organization, and he's pulled out of the World Health Organization and the Paris Agreement and the Iran nuclear deal, and so on and so on. And the big question for 2021 is, to what extent can Joe Biden repair some of that damage? And to what extent is this shift and the crumbling of these institutions happening anyway? And the answer is it's a bit of both. So Joe Biden will be able to rejoin the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Agreement. That will be quite straightforward. Restarting the Iran nuclear deal will be quite a lot more difficult. And then in other respects, this is really a long-term shift. This is a manifestation of the rise of China. And this is essentially, what we thought in the late 1990s when people talked about the end of history, and they thought that everything in the world was converging on a single set of rules and globalization, a single market, and that's clearly not the case. And for the past 10 years, globalization has actually been going backwards. So globalization peaked in about 2008 with the global financial crisis. And since then, there's been a move towards more regional trade. So most trade in Europe and most trade in Asia is actually regional and not global. And on other measures too, like foreign direct investment, globalization has actually been going backwards for the past 10 years. So there's more going on here than just Donald Trump smashing things up. And really what's happening here is a longer term trend. So Joe Biden will be able to fix some things, but not all these things. And the other thing is that there are changes in other respects. Obviously, Angela Merkel will be stepping down at the end of next year, and we're going to have a new leader in Germany. We have a new prime minister in Japan as well. So there's really quite a lot of uncertainty about the leadership at the top, and how these changes of personnel will change things next year. One big question is what will happen with the relationship between America and China? And that's the fourth trend. Can we have the next slide, please? So we've obviously had a lot of tension between the US and China under Donald Trump, and he has fought this trade war and started various fights with China, but most importantly on trade and imposing tariffs on an enormous amount of Chinese exports to America. And we can expect to see more of this with Joe Biden. He's not going to simply call this off. A lot of people, in fact, although they disagree with the way Trump has picked this fight with China and the methods that he's used, they do agree with the objective, which is that pressure should be put on China to play fair in global markets and allow foreign countries and companies access to its internal markets and so on. And essentially, the argument is, if we let the Chinese come into Western markets, shouldn't they do the same for us? So a lot of people agree with that basic idea, but they disagree with the way that Trump has gone about putting pressure on China. And I think what we can expect to see from Joe Biden is an attempt to assemble a broader Western coalition, including Europe and Japan, to try and fight the same trade war, but in a smarter way and a more nuanced and a more subtle way. So I don't think the trade war will come to an end. I don't think he will get rid of Trump's tariffs. He will use them as leverage. And I think he will try to mend fences with Europe in particular. So Trump also started a trade war with Europe and did things like, he put tariffs on French wine and so on. So I think we're likely to see détente between Europe and America over trade in order to present a more unified front towards China. Now, this is a weird trade war between the US and China. We call it a new kind of Cold War, because if you look at the previous Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West, there was no trade to speak of between the Soviet Union and the West. They were basically economically separate. And that's not the case at all with China and the West. We do an enormous amount of trade, and supply chains are interwoven in so many ways. So, my iPhone is designed in America, but it's made in China, and it's very difficult to uncouple those supply chains. So there is a big question about how far uncoupling will go as a result of this trade battle, and countries and companies are trying very hard not to have to pick sides in this battle. They don't want to have to be either in America's camp or in China's camp, whether it's on 5G networks or other things, payment systems. I mean, there's all sorts of areas where America and China are trying to keep different countries and companies on side. So we're going to see, I think, more tension between China and America. We're just going to see the fight being waged in a slightly more intelligent way by America. Let's move on to the next one. companies find themselves in the middle of this fight because essentially they are very often the battleground where the fight is taking place. So, for example, Huawei is a famous company where America is using attacks on Huawei as a way to attack China and a way to try and get European countries to penalize China by not using Huawei equipment. TikTok has also been another recent example of this. But in fact, it's very widespread. We've seen this with European foods, whether it's French wine or cheese or Italian cheese, I think as well was involved in this, and olives and so forth. And basically, companies are being used through these tariffs to put pressure on the countries where they reside, and we're seeing more and more of this happening. And whatever you make, it's very difficult to stay out of these fights if a politician decides to target you. The other thing that's happened that has also meant that that business people have to be politicians, CEOs, they all have to be politicians now, not only because of these trade fights, but also because they are expected to take positions on things like climate change and racial justice. And this is because politicians are not doing enough or not doing anything at all to address these big problems. And so shareholders and consumers are putting pressure on companies to act in their place. And so all of this is really politicizing business in a way that we haven't seen before. And it makes it very difficult for companies because when they take a position, they risk alienating some of their customers. We've just seen this morning that a group of CEOs in America are calling on Donald Trump to concede the election and begin the transition process because it's bad for business to have all of this uncertainty. So they've taken that political position that he should be doing this. And obviously some of their customers may think that they should be staying out of politics. They shouldn't be taking a position. They shouldn't be, in effect, standing up for Joe Biden. So we're seeing more and more of this, and we're seeing a growing expectation from consumers that companies will take stands on things. And that really is a reflection of the poor levels of trust that people now have in their politicians. They trust companies more than politicians. Who would have thought? Next slide, please. A big thing that's been going on this year is the acceleration of technological change. We've had, by some measures, 5 years of progress in e-commerce and online learning and obviously remote working and so forth. If you look at where people predicted those things would be in 2025, we've jumped there in a few months this year. And we call this tech-acceleration. So the big question for next year is how much of these changes how much will they snap back? Clearly, we're not going to go on using all of this technology to the full extent that we do now when it's possible to meet in person and go back to the office and shop in real shops and so on. But at the same time, it's obvious that we're not going to go back to the way things were before either. So we're going to end up somewhere in the middle. And where in the middle is a very difficult thing to work out because it depends on which industry you're in and which country you're in. So it turns out that some industries like technology and finance are much more relaxed about letting people work from home in the future. And other industries are not so relaxed about it. And then it also varies by country. So European and American firms seem to be quite cool about people working from home. Chinese companies, not so much. So there's going to be a new reality, and it's going to look very different from the way things looked before the pandemic. We're not going to go back to that. And that means that everybody's going to have to adjust to that. And that means that companies are going to have to adjust to that new reality as well. Whether you're a chain of sandwich stores and you're not quite sure how many of your stores you're going to reopen, or a cloud computing provider, you're going to have to adjust to this new pattern of demand. And so it's going to be very important for companies to be agile in the coming year or two as they adjust to this new reality. And we have the next slide, please. So this slide very quickly just shows you the extent to which new behaviors have been adopted by different people in different countries. And as you can see, it's very, very patchy. And I include it just because it shows you how difficult it is to predict whether a new behavior is going to stick or not, because it depends where you are and it depends what the behavior is. Next slide, please. Another big shift we've seen this year has been much less travel, whether it's tourism or business travel. And we're going to see less travel next year as well. People going on holiday in the country where they live, less international travel, less business travel, because video conferencing, it turns out, can do this quite well. And companies don't have a lot of money to spend at the moment, so it's an obvious thing to cut back on. We're also seeing fewer migrants and fewer people traveling for education, and this is very bad news for businesses, for universities whose business depends on foreign students. And in many countries, universities depend on foreign students to keep them going. So that's going to require them to change how they operate, and is going to be very difficult. If you look at the change in holidays, Airbnb says that more than 80% of its bookings are now in the same country, and people are booking not just in the same country, but within 200 miles of where they live. So it really has shifted completely. And Airbnb is a great example of a company that has been able to cope with this change in demand. Its IPO looked like it was doomed, but now its IPO is back on again because they've been able to adapt very quickly. And I think that's the kind of thing we're going to continue to see more of that next year. We're not going to go back to the tourist industry being where it was before pandemic, probably ever actually, but certainly if we do go back to where we were before, it will take several years. And part of the reason for that is that people are much more aware now of the environmental impact of travel. And this is a great opportunity for people to act and change the way they think about travel. And that's in fact the next trend. So next slide, please. All of this is a big opportunity to act on climate. In fact, the lockdowns have not made a very big difference to the overall climate picture. Reducing emissions by 8% globally, which is what's going to have happened this year, doesn't really make a dent because we've been putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere for 200 years. So stopping for a year doesn't really fix the problem. It's basically all still there. The challenge is to get emissions down to zero. So we need to cut them by 100%, not by 8%. And you can see how much disruption a cut of 8% has caused to our economies this year. So imagine doing that every year for 20 years, and that gives you a sense of the scale of the challenge of addressing climate change. However, there is an opportunity here because many governments, including the European Union, has a big recovery fund, and in America, Joe Biden wants to pass a big recovery bill that have a green component in them, and they allocate a large chunk of the spending on new green infrastructure, and this is great because it creates jobs, and there are going to be a lot of people who need jobs as a result of all of this chaos. But it creates green jobs that really help address climate change, and so there's an opportunity here to really make a difference. And it's maybe not the opportunity you think it is. Just because there were fewer planes flying for 6 months doesn't really make that much difference. But governments can do things like say, well, if they're going to bail out an airline, then the airline has to, invest in green planes or invest in research in that area or whatever. So this really gives governments a lot of influence to try and change the path that we're on as far as the climate is concerned, which is very good news. And at the end of 2021, we're going to see the COP26 conference in Britain, where countries from around the world are going to get together and make pledges for how much they're going to cut their emissions in future. So that will be worth watching. China has just made this very ambitious claim that it's going to peak its emissions by 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2060. And that really is very welcome news and puts pressure on other countries to make similarly ambitious claims about how much they're going to cut their carbon emissions in the future. Next slide, please. That conference that I mentioned, COP26, is just one of many things happening in 2021 that will be held over from 2020. The Olympics is another big example. There's also a big nuclear arms reduction conference that happens every 5 years that was put off from this year. And many people, of course, have had personal things like weddings delayed, and they will be moving them into 2021. So it will be a strange year because it will feel like 2020 part 2 or a second take on 2020. There will be a lot of deja vu, I think, in 2021, and that will feel quite disorientating. And finally, last slide, please. The 10th thing here is I think this will mean that more attention is paid to other examples of threats that we could see coming. So a lot of people have been talking about the dangers of a pandemic for the past few years, but nobody was really paying attention to them. And fortunately, enough preparation work was done in areas like vaccines these vaccine platforms were created, which made it much easier to create vaccines this year. So one of the reasons we've got those vaccines so quickly is because of this preparation work that was being done behind the scenes. And this means that people who are worried about other threats that we know about that could be very bad, but that we're not taking very seriously, will be saying to policymakers in 2021, okay, now we need to worry about this other thing, which could also be a big problem. So antibiotic resistance is a good example of that. There are also people worried about nuclear proliferation, nuclear terrorism. There are some people who are worried about artificial intelligence going bad. I'm personally less worried about that one. But there are all of these areas where we ought to have seen things. We know there's a potential problem, and we ought to be better prepared than we are for it. So I hope that that will mean that policymakers pay more attention. One question is, given that people who have been trying to predict the future, like me at The Economist, we had a very bad year in 2020, obviously, because we didn't expect the coronavirus pandemic. Does that mean that will we see a little more humility from forecasters in 2021? I think that would be a prediction too far, and I will stop there. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I think we have a couple of minutes. Well, I can't hear anything if anything is happening. I can't see anything either.